The cart's left wheel had developed a squeak sometime around Thanksgiving, and I'd learned to tilt it slightly to the right when turning corners. The way you compensate for a car that pulls, adjusting without thinking until the correction becomes instinct. 3 years of pushing returns through the stack sacks of the Millbrook branch had taught me every personality of this building. Which floorboards groaned near the poetry section. How the heating clicked off 11 minutes before the thermostat registered cold again. The particular quality of light that came through the east windows, in late afternoon, warm and dusty, falling across the reading tables in long rectangles that the regulars shifted their chairs to follow like sunflowers. It was December, 2 weeks before Christmas, and the branch smelled of pine from the wreath Janet had hung on the front desk. Her own, brought from home, because the city's facilities budget didn't stretch to holiday decorations for branch libraries. It barely stretched to functional heating. Janet Oakes had managed Millbrook for 16 years. She was the kind of librarian who remembered that Mrs. Whitfield couldn't do small print anymore, and always pulled the large type edition before the woman even asked. She kept a jar of peppermint candies behind the desk for the kids who came in after school, and she argued fiercely at every budget hearing for the 3 blocks of Northwest Portland that Millbrook served. She never won exactly, but she never let them forget the branch existed. I'd been here 3 years, since I dropped out of my master's program at the University of Oregon. Money, mostly. And after my mom's diagnosis, partly something else, the need to be useful somewhere real, not theoretical. The job paid $38,000 a year with city benefits, which in Portland meant I could afford a studio apartment in the same neighborhood if I was careful. I was always careful. I knew every regular by name. Mrs. Whitfield, Tuesdays and Thursdays, large print mysteries. The Delgado kids on Saturday mornings when their parents worked. Marcus, who was 16, quietly gay in a household that didn't know it yet, who came after school to use the computers and read, and who I'd learned to simply leave alone with a stack of whatever I thought he'd like. Old Mr. Hanford, who'd been coming since before I was born, and who still tipped his hat when he left. I loved this job in a way that's hard to explain to people who think libraries are just buildings full of books. They're not. They're one of the last public spaces in America, where nobody asks you to buy anything, where you can sit for 4 hours and nobody looks at you sideways, where a kid from a house full of noise can find 20 minutes of quiet. I understood that value with my whole body. The way you understand things you learned when you had nothing. Which is why the morning everything changed felt so ordinary. I was shelving returns, cart squeaking in its familiar way, when the glass door swung open and a woman in a coat stepped in, followed by a man whose presence I felt before I properly saw him. I was crouched behind the low shelf in the children's section, helping Charlie Reeves, 7 years old, extremely serious about dragons, find exactly the right book in exactly the right series. Charlie had explained to me twice already that the dragons had to breathe fire, not ice, and they had to be the main character, not the sidekick. This one, I said, pulling a title from the shelf, the dragon in this one is the actual hero, not helping anyone, just being the hero. Charlie's face broke into the particular joy of a child who has been exactly understood. He grabbed the book with both hands. I laughed genuinely. That full laugh I didn't always let out in public, and looked up. The man was watching me. He was maybe 15 feet away, having stopped somewhere in the middle of the children's floor, and his eyes were on my face with an expression I couldn't read. Dark eyes. Still, the woman with him had continued toward the desk and was speaking to Janet, but he hadn't moved. I smiled reflexively. The tail end of the laugh was still on my face, and I didn't have time to compose it into something more professional. Then I registered the cut of his clothes and the look of the woman with him, and I thought, city official, and my stomach dropped half an inch. He looked away first. He walked toward the desk. That's Damien Cross. Janet told me quietly when I brought the cart around front. Her voice was even, but her hands weren't. She was gripping the edge of the desk. Cross Development Group. He bought the building. I'd heard the rumors. The city had been selling off underused properties to close a budget gap, and the Millbrook building had reportedly been on the short list. Janet had assured us it was just talk. He's here to assess the space, she said, for redevelopment. I watched him move through the branch. He did it quietly, the way people do when they know the weight of what they're doing and aren't performative about it. He looked at everything, not with contempt that I could have handled, with something more like attention. When he left, he spoke briefly to Janet, handed her a card, and thanked her for her time. At the door, he paused and looked back, not at the building. At me. The next 3 weeks were the worst kind of uncertainty. Not knowing but knowing, the way you know a storm is coming when the air pressure changes. Janet called a staff meeting on a Wednesday and told us the branch would close the 1st of February. The city's contract with Cross Development required vacant possession. There would be no new location. There wasn't funding for one. Mrs. Whitfield cried, not loudly. She just sat in her usual chair with tears running down her face, and when I brought her tissues, she said, "Where will I go on Tuesdays?" And I didn't have an answer. I'm not going to pretend I handled it gracefully. I went home to my studio and sat on my second-hand couch and stared at the wall for a long time. I'd built my whole adult life inside those 4 walls. Not the building, but the people and the rhythms and the small daily weight of being somewhere that mattered. 2 weeks after the announcement, I came in on a Thursday to find Janet waiting. "He wants to meet with you," she said. I knew who she meant. He came at 10, alone this time, no assistant, dark slacks and a black sweater that made him look less corporate and somehow more deliberate. He was around 40, I guessed, dark hair going silver at the temples, strong jaw, a small scar below his right collarbone, visible at the open neck of his sweater, a white crescent that caught the light when he moved. We sat at one of the reading tables. Children's drawings on the wall behind him, cardboard snowflakes Janet had made with the after-school group. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "No preamble. My company's new development will include a community resource center. I need someone to design what that actually looks like, not manage a building. Design the programming and culture of the space. You're closing the library and replacing it with a resource center. I'm closing a branch that the city was already going to close within 18 months for budget reasons. With or without my involvement." His voice was measured. "I'm offering something in its place that I can actually fund and sustain." Why me? Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Because of the way you talked to that kid about dragons. Because you remembered that Mrs. Whitfield can't read small print. I spoke with her on my way out last time. And because... He paused. "When you looked up at me that first day, you had no idea who I was. You just smiled because you were happy. I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people, and that doesn't happen." The words landed somewhere I wasn't expecting them to reach. "That's a strange reason to offer someone a job," I said. "Probably." His expression didn't change, but it's the honest one. I told him I'd think about it. I drove home and told myself I would say no. Janet said what I expected her to say. "Take it." She said she had grandkids in Bend and had been putting the move off for years. She said the branch was already dying, and at least this way something came from it. She said he'd seen something in me that I didn't see in myself. I said yes 8 days later. The Community Relations Director position at Cross Development Group paid $72,000 a year with full benefits. Actual dental coverage, actual vision, a 401(n) with matching. I stared at the offer letter until the number lost its shape. My entire adult life had been a calculation of whether I could cover rent, loan minimums, and groceries without touching savings. This number unmade that calculation entirely. I worked through the library's last 2 weeks and stood with Janet and the regulars when we locked the doors on a February morning that was gray and cold and smelled of the river. Mrs. Whitfield was there. The Delgado kids. Marcus, who was 17 and had been accepted early decision to read, who hugged me hard and whispered thanks without explaining for what, I knew. I cried in my car for 20 minutes, then I drove to my new office. The next several weeks were dizzying in the way of very large changes. The kind where the ground you've always stood on simply isn't there anymore, and you're moving forward because stopping isn't an option. The Cross Development Group occupied 4 floors of a glass tower downtown. My office had a view of the West Hills, and the first time I sat at my desk, I felt like a person who had walked into the wrong room and was waiting to be found out. I was not found out, partly because I worked harder than I'd worked at anything since undergrad. I spent the first month absorbing everything, talking to community organizations, meeting with neighborhood associations, visiting resource centers in other cities that had tried to incorporate genuine public space. I filled 2 notebooks. I annoyed everyone I could find with questions. Damien was present in a way I hadn't expected. He showed up at meetings I was running, not to direct them but to listen. He asked good questions and deferred to my answers in front of other people, which is a specific kind of professional respect that is rarer than it should be. He called me Sonny. "I found this out the way you find out things like this," he said it once, offhand, in passing in a hallway when he was late for something else. "Morning, Sonny," and walked on. I stood there for a moment. When I asked him about it later, he looked briefly uncomfortable, which on his face was a subtle thing. "First day I came to the library," he said. "You were laughing at something the kid said, and then you looked up at me, and your face was—" He stopped. "Sonny." It was the first word I thought. I told myself it was just a nickname, a professional eccentricity. I lied to myself about this for approximately 6 weeks. He asked me to dinner in March, framed as a meeting with the project architect. The architect canceled last minute, and Damien texted to ask if I still wanted to go. I looked at the text for a long time. I went. The restaurant was the kind with no prices on the menu, and lighting designed to make everyone look like their best self. I wore the nicest thing I owned, a black dress I'd bought secondhand, and my grandmother's earrings. He stood when I walked in, which I had not expected, and his expression when he saw me did something I chose not to examine too closely. We talked for 3 hours, not about the project, about his childhood in Pittsburgh, working class, a father who worked at a steel mill, a mother who kept a library card and used it constantly, about how he'd built his first development with borrowed money, and a desperation that he recognized in me now, across a table that occupied a room that neither of us had grown up able to afford. About loss. He'd lost his father the year he signed his first major contract, and had never quite reconciled those 2 things. I told him about my mom, 3 years into remission, and recently started a garden in her backyard in Eugene, which felt like the best possible news. I told him about dropping out and how I'd tried to feel like a failure about it, but mostly felt like I'd made the only choice that made sense. He listened like the information mattered to him. "Sonny," he said, walking me to my car afterward. The March air was cold and damp the way Portland is in March, and I had my hands in my coat pockets. "I need you to know something." I waited. "This is complicated. You work for me, and I'm aware that creates something it shouldn't. But I've tried hard for 2 months to find this less than what it is, and I'm not getting anywhere." I looked at him in the amber of the parking garage lights. "And what is it?" "Something I haven't felt in a long time." He said it simply, without apparent embarrassment. "I wanted to be honest with you before it went any further. You deserve that." I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "I appreciate the honesty." And I kissed him first, which surprised us both. The next 4 months were the kind that exist in memory as warmth. We were careful at the office, professional, correct. But outside of it, in the small hours and weekends, and the margins of days, something was growing that felt too real and too large for me to look at directly. He was thoughtful in the specific way of someone who learned early that thoughtfulness is the only real currency that doesn't depreciate. He remembered things I said and acted on them weeks later. He called at strange times just to hear my voice. He called me Sonny, and I had stopped pretending I was unaffected by it. I should have understood sooner that almost nothing good comes without a counterweight. It was a Tuesday in July, 40 minutes before close, when the door opened and 2 men walked in. I knew immediately, in the way your body knows before your mind catches up, that something was wrong. They weren't here to browse. The larger one looked at me like I was a detail he was cataloging. "You're Clara Moss. You're with Damien Cross." My hand moved toward my phone on the desk. "Don't," he said it quietly. He didn't need to elaborate. They stayed 6 minutes. They told me to give Damien a name, Arnaldo, and tell him that the Portland project needed to accommodate certain arrangements. That old agreements don't just disappear, that they knew where I worked, where I lived. After they left, my legs didn't work right for several minutes. I sat on the floor behind the desk and breathed. Then I called Damien. He answered on the second ring. I told him exactly what had happened. There was a long silence on the line. Clara. His voice had changed into something I'd never heard from him. Controlled in the way that control is a lid on something very hot. Lock the front door. Don't go to your car yet. I'm coming. He arrived in 22 minutes with a man named Reggie, who did not explain his job, but whose systematic sweep of the building's perimeter explained it for him. Damien held my face in both hands and looked at me the way you look at something you almost lost. Then he exhaled slowly. Are you hurt? No, tell me who Arnaldo is. He sat down. When I was 29, he said, I needed a bridge loan to close my first major deal, a warehouse conversion in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I was 3 days from losing everything. Someone made an introduction. Arnaldo Reyes, who presented as a private equity investor. The money was clean on paper. The loan got paid back in full within the year. But I found out 2 years later that Reyes had connections to a money laundering operation running through at least 6 East Coast cities. By the time I knew, I'd already used the money. I'd built something with it. He looked at his hands. I told myself it was over. I kept my head down, and I built only legitimate things for 10 years. But he didn't forget. Men like that have very long memories. I thought about what I'd just heard. About the weight of a decision made a decade ago in a desperate week. About how long you can outrun something before it learns your address. What does he want? Probably access. The Portland project is a significant asset in a desirable corridor. He wants some of it funneled through, or a quiet stake, or he wants to use the development as cover for other transactions. Damien's jaw was tight. Whatever it is, I'm not doing it. Then what are the options? He was quiet. Then he said what I already knew he would say. I could pay him, which doesn't end it. I could try to cut contact and hope he moves on, which he won't, or you go to the FBI, I said. He looked at me. You go to them first, I said. Before they come to you, you give them everything. The original transaction, every contact you've had with him since, whatever documentation you have, you cooperate fully. Clara, that means admitting to what I knew, and when I knew it, I'll face exposure, significant fines at minimum. I'll lose the Portland project, possibly others. I know. He searched my face. You're asking me to dismantle something I spent 15 years building. I'm asking you to stop carrying something that's going to crush you. I held his gaze. And I can't be with someone who makes a different choice. That's not a threat. It's just the truth. I need you to be someone I can actually know. He didn't answer that night. He didn't call for 2 days. I went to work and did my job and tried not to calculate what his silence meant. On the third morning, he called at 7:15 while I was making coffee. I spoke with a federal criminal defense attorney, he said. She says cooperation is the strongest position available to me. She thinks I can avoid prison if I move first and I'm thorough. He paused. I'm meeting with the FBI on Friday. My knees went weak with something that was relief and grief at the same time. I'm also pulling the Portland project, he said. The development as designed. Reyes wanted access to it. I'm not building something that started with his shadow on it. I'll return the city's option, and the Millbrook building stays as it is. I stood in my kitchen in my pajamas, holding my coffee mug with both hands. You're keeping the library, I said. I'm keeping the library. A pause. Among other reasons, because someone I care about would probably never forgive me if I didn't. What followed was not simple or clean. The federal investigation took 8 months. Damien's cooperation was thorough. He handed over documentation from the original Allentown transaction, every communication that had come since, everything he had. Arnaldo Reyes was indicted along with 9 others. Damien received a deferred prosecution agreement. No prison, provided he met the terms. Substantial fines paid in full. Ongoing cooperation through the duration of the investigation. 3 years of monitored compliance. He paid the fines within 30 days. It cost him a great deal. Not everything. The company survived, restructured, with a small team that had been with him long enough to understand what they were preserving. But it cost him several contracts, serious money, and roughly half his professional relationships, which in development is most of what you have. I was not with him every day of it. We talked honestly about whether I should step back, whether the complexity of his situation made my presence unfair to him, or complicated the investigation, or simply looked bad in ways that would cost him further. We decided together that stepping back for appearances was the kind of small dishonesty that tends to grow. So I stayed. I was present on the hard days. I didn't rescue him or manage his feelings. I just stayed. I also kept working. Without the Portland development, I shifted to a different cross project in a different city and designed the community space there from scratch, applying everything I'd absorbed from 3 years at Millbrook and 8 months of paying close attention to what people actually need when they walk into a room that is supposed to belong to them. The space opened in October. On the opening day, I walked through the doors and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I had made something rather than simply survived something. In November, Damien drove to Portland on a Saturday and found me at the Millbrook branch, which had reopened under a community foundation arrangement that he'd funded and I'd helped design. I was shelving returns. The cart still squeaked because I'd specifically requested the same one. Mrs. Whitfield was in her usual chair, with a large print mystery open in her lap. Marcus was at one of the tables, home from his first semester at Reed, studying for finals, a stack of books at his elbow that had nothing to do with his coursework. The particular hush of a room full of people reading lay over everything like something physical. Damien stood in the doorway and took it in, the lopsided cardboard snowflakes on the window. I'd made them myself after Janet retired to Bend, and they were not as good as hers, but they were there. The warmth, the quiet, purposeful presence of people who had somewhere to be. His face did the thing it does. The thing I'd first seen in a parking garage in March in bad lighting, a dropping of the specific weight that people who carry a great deal of power carry at all times around other people. An openness. He looked, for a moment, like someone who had put something heavy down and was remembering what it felt like to stand up straight. I smiled at him from across the room. The real one, the one that started as a laugh years ago in this same building when I was crouched on the floor, helping a 7-year-old find a book about dragons, the one that had apparently set everything in motion that brought us here. I hadn't known it mattered. I hadn't been performing anything. I'd just been happy for a second, in an unguarded way, in a place I loved. He smiled back, then he walked toward me, unhurried, the way a person walks when they have arrived somewhere they meant to be. "There she is," he said quietly, just to me. I tilted the squeaky cart to the right, the way I always do when it needs to turn, and walked over to meet him halfway. Some moments arrive dressed as ordinary. You don't recognize them until later, looking back at the whole shape of a life, when you can see that the thing which changed everything was something small. A child asking for exactly the right book, a stranger walking through a door at exactly the wrong time, and a smile that had no particular reason to matter, except that to one person, on one specific morning, it was the first true thing he'd seen in years. That's what I think about now, whenever I push that cart through the stacks and the wheel gives its familiar squeak. Not the grand version of the story, with the crisis and the choices and the cost. Just that morning, just Charlie with his dragons, just looking up and finding someone looking back. Some things don't need to be dramatic to be enough, they just need to be real.